episode 23. For those of you here for the first time, welcome, and a huge welcome back if you're returning. I'm Dr. Catherine Hughes. Today's podcast is going to be taking a look at David Pomphret. He has got to be the most unlikely killer I've ever done a profile of. He hit his wife, Anne-Marie, over the head with a crowbar near their home in Cheshire in November 2018. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. As I said, this is the most unlikely murderer I've ever come across. He seemed all to be a genuinely nice man and was really well liked by his family and friends. David Pomphret was an IT specialist who'd worked for Barclays Bank. He was described as being a very quiet and unassuming man. During his trial, the victim's mother, Carol Buckley, said that David was an angel and that he deserved a medal for putting up with her daughter Marie. She also said, "I couldn't have wished for a better son-in-law or dad for Megan." She described her daughter as the driving force in their relationship. Ms. Buckley also said that her daughter could easily take the huff, blocking her on Facebook over something she'd said, and that 3 years before her death, she'd been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which can affect a person's social skills. Kenneth Crane, Ms. Buckley's partner, said in a statement, "Marie, I would describe as a Jekyll and Hyde type character. She was like a volcano. She could erupt at any time without warning. I would describe David as a very quiet bloke. He would never talk or chat." So the picture that emerged during researching this murder is that Anne-Marie Pomphret was aggressive and abusive. Megan Pomphret, their daughter, said that her mother would insult her father with the most horrific language. She described her father as the calmest father on the planet. She said that sometimes a switch would just flick with her mum and she would say all hell would break loose. She went on to say, "My mum's not the easiest person to get along with some of the time." She said that her father taught her how to handle her mother. She said it's really good having a dad who's really supportive like that. Megan said that there were times when her mum would throw her toys out of the pram, so she put it, and her dad would go after her and she'd see the error of her ways and she'd come back. As I've already mentioned, Anne-Marie was diagnosed as having Asperger's syndrome. The press picked up on this at the time and inferred that her aggression was because of this condition. Asperger's syndrome is part of the autistic spectrum disorder. Those with Asperger's syndrome tend to have an average or above average intelligence. People with Asperger's syndrome see, hear and feel the word differently to every other person. They have difficulty interpreting other people's emotions, their thoughts, their body language. Although those with autism and Asperger's can experience a great deal of anxiety, there's no proven link between autism and violent behaviour. Anne-Marie's mother said that they married in 1997 and her and David shared an interest in horses. As you've already heard, she spoke very kindly about the man who killed her daughter. She would have known firsthand just how difficult her daughter was to live with. Anne-Marie was violent and aggressive, and she'd verbally abused both Megan and David. Yet David Pomphret appeared to manage fairly well, and because of his calm nature, he always managed to diffuse these situations. Before the day of the murder, he'd never ever retaliated in any way. Depending on the newspaper that you read, the tone of the article was quite different. The Liverpool Echo showed a picture of the pair shopping in Asda earlier in the day of the murder, saying, "This is the moment David Pomphret and his tragic wife Anne-Marie were snapped casually shopping in Asda supermarket just an hour before she was brutally murdered. The calculating 51-year-old used a metal crowbar to brutally strike her skull up to 30 times at a remote horse stables that the couple owned in Warrington. On the day of the murder, they went shopping and then they went to their stables to see their horses. They began to argue about picking up tools to do some DIY back at their home. David Pomphret said she called Meg a fat slag. She didn't like the clothes that she was wearing They were too short and too revealing. He said that Anne-Marie had told him that I was a crap parent, encouraging Meg to go out on Saturday night, and the only reason Meg was going out was for sex. He said that she ranted at me for being a bad parent, calling me effing useless. She called me limp and useless. He said, a bit embarrassing really, I've been having erectile dysfunction. I was not performing very well. Marie at this point was absolutely raging in their argument, finger pointing, screaming and shouting at David. She then slapped him across the face. Now he says, I remember reaching out and grabbing her hood, and I don't remember, he told the court. The next thing that he remembers is standing over his wife's body. He'd used a crowbar to hit his wife over the head. Because of the extent of the injuries, it was impossible to determine the exact number of blows, but it was thought to be about 30. He hit her over the head again and again in a frenzied attack. This indicates that it was anger that had grown and grown until he just couldn't contain it anymore. The proverbial red mist, where he acted without thinking. He later told the court, I was standing at the side of her body. There was blood on my hands and on the crowbar. She was on the floor, he said. I'd just killed my wife. I was just horrified. Up until this point, it's possible to argue that he snapped due to the years of abuse and violence. This could have been a momentary loss of control, and it could have been argued that he was simply attempting to defend himself. I know if anyone said anything that derogatory about my children, I probably would retaliate, although I wouldn't go as far as David Pomphret did. This was a very prolonged attack, and she would have fell to the floor as he carried on hitting her. I know that I don't normally include as many details about the case. I do prefer to stick to the psychology of the behaviour. However, in this case, I feel that knowing the background and the details of the crime helps you just to understand how much of a mild-mannered man and how he'd become a murderer. I believe it also helps to clarify why this is a case of murder and not manslaughter due to a temporary loss of control. He was a man who'd been ground down. He'd been attacked and he'd been humiliated over many years. Perhaps if the gender roles were reversed, more people would have been sympathetic to someone who'd suffered years of domestic abuse. However, it's his following actions that make this murder rather than manslaughter. David Pomphret cleaned the weapons of the blood. He threw the crowbar into a pond, and that was recovered a week later when police drained the water away. He stashed a hammer in a rabbit hole. He burned his t-shirt in an incinerator and placed his trousers and trainers into a plastic bag, which he threw onto an embankment of the M62 when cycling between the crime scene and their home. He also rang and sent concerned texts to Anne-Marie's phone. This would have all been done after he regained control of his emotions and thought about what he'd done. So for me, disposing of the weapons and getting rid of his clothing was callous. He wasn't mournful about what he'd done. He was only thinking about getting away with it at that point. He was arrested the next day, and at first he denied killing his wife. He initially said that she'd not returned home and he went looking for her. When he found her, he dialed 999, he told the police, saying that he'd found his wife lying in a pool of blood, looking very dead, adding, "It looks like she's had her head beaten in." It was only later in court that he admitted to trying to cover up the killing by burning his clothes. Whenever there's a murder, it's most likely that the victim and the perpetrator will know each other. Stranger murders, of course, do occur, but they are quite rare. Police always begin an investigation by looking at who is closest to the deceased. They examine those who had access to the victim and those who had motive to kill. After being arrested and released on bail, he was interviewed several more times by the police. He was interviewed 15 times, and throughout that he maintained his innocence. He finally changed his story and admitted to killing his wife once he was faced with the undeniable evidence of her blood on his socks, meaning that he was at the crime scene. The socks would have been examined by a forensics officer and shown a pattern of blood spatter that's consistent with blood moving through the air rather than dripping on them as he was near her body. He claimed in court that he had a momentary lapse of control due to the abuse and should therefore be convicted of manslaughter and not murder. However, his behaviour following the killing isn't consistent with that. These actions are not those of someone who's temporarily lost control. They're the actions of a rational human being doing all that they can to get away with a crime. I can empathise to a degree with someone who's suffered years of verbal and physical abuse and know that Anne-Marie had mental health problems and Asperger's syndrome. However, that doesn't make her behaviour any easier to deal with. I've spoken to many domestic abuse survivors who said that they fantasised about killing their abuser. Simply leaving the relationship isn't always a viable option. I can understand completely a person getting to a point where they can no longer take it and they just snap. However, I cannot and will not say that this is in any way a justification for killing another person. I hope you found today's episode psychological analysis of David Pomphret interesting, and as always, hope that you learned something new. If you did enjoy it, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Details are in the podcast description. Thanks for listening then. See you soon. Bye for now.